Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to kind of work on finishing up the rest of the chapter. We're going to, and I know this is going to disappoint a lot of you, but we're going to discard the gross anatomy of the circulatory system, meaning we're not going to go through all the major vessels and name them and do all that. We're going to move on. We want to get the major part of what circulation is about and how it works done, and we're going to forego the major and anatomical naming of all those vessels. Once again, I apologize for those of you that want to do that, but that's what we're going to do. I will mention, though, because I think it's so important, a special kind of circulation that goes on within the vessels in the body, and that is a portal system. A portal system is basically where arterial blood is going to move into two capillary beds before it goes back to the heart. And in this particular case, we're going to see the hepatic portal system, which is the one that goes to the liver. And there's also another major portal system that goes to the kidneys, and basically the same thing happens. When nutrients are picked up from the intestinal tract, they are going to be sent. That blood is going to be sent to the liver for evaluation of the materials within it. Okay, they're going to take some of them out, store them in certain forms. We're going to detoxify other things. So the liver is called the organ of 1,000 jobs. It's going to take its survey of all the contents of the blood, and it's going to make some adjustments. Okay, so what happens is a capillary bed forms in the liver after the capillary bed that was formed in the intestinal walls. So we absorb all those nutrients and toxins and whatever is in the digestive tract. That is absorbed. It's then sent by way of the hepatic portal vein to the liver, where it breaks again into capillaries. And then the liver does its job. It sometimes stores nutrients, sometimes breaks down toxins, whatever it's doing. It's going to do its job, and then it's going to send its blood back out of the capillary into a major vein, and then it's going to send it back to the heart. The same thing occurs in the kidney situation. There's going to be metabolic wastes that are going to be picked up by the blood, and it's going to be sent to the kidney, and it's going to take out anything that's in excess in the blood system. It's going to take out impurities. It's going to basically, through pressure, it's going to filter the blood. And then once that capillary bed breaks up and goes back into a vein, it'll take it back to the heart. So the hepatic portal system and the renal portal system are two important portal systems in our body that carry on a lot of important functions for us. Once again, it's a situation where we have two capillary beds. We go from one capillary bed to a vein, back to a capillary bed, back to a vein. And it's a very unusual situation in the body. We do have a very small portal system between the anterior lobe of the pituitary and the brain, where releasing factors are going to be used in a portal system there. But that's a very, very tiny portal system. So, but it is a portal system nonetheless. So that's what a portal system is. Just generally, I want you to know what a portal system is. So we can move on from there. Okay, so we're moving on to basically the physiology of circulation, and we start there with basically the things that in a hospital that if you're in a hospital, they'll check on a regular basis, and those are your vital signs. Are you breathing? Do you have a pulse? What is your pulse? How much pressure do you have in your blood vessels, which is blood pressure? Those are all vital signs that are going to be taken to give a general view of what your health is about. So your pulse is basically going to be produced when the left ventricle forcefully pushes blood into the aorta, and then it quickly branches into artery after artery. Now, as the arteries branch, the pressure will obviously go down in those arteries as it gets closer and closer toward the capillary bed. And generally speaking, arteries are going to be kept deep into the tissues, and there's a good reason for that, because if we didn't keep the arteries deep into the tissue and they got damaged, they bleed much more because they're under higher pressure than veins are. So there are only a few parts of the body where we can find fairly large-sized arteries that are toward the superficial part of the body, and those are the areas where we can actually take our pulse, which is a pressure or a wave of blood that comes from each heartbeat. So it's monitored at what we call pressure points in arteries where pulse is easily palpated, and that is arteries that are superficial and not deep into the tissues. Some of the areas that we can do that are pretty common to you. A lot of people take their pulse on the carotid artery in their neck, or they take it in the radial artery in the wrist. Generally speaking, the pulse, we talked about the pulse being about 75 beats per minute of the average adult. It can be anywhere from below 60 to into the 80s. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're unhealthy if you're either one of those. It just means that's what your pulse is. Now, a lot of different places in the body where we're going to have this superficial artery where we can pick up the pulse. We can see all the way down here from your feet all the way to the top of your head. You can find an area. Now, obviously, pulse is going to be a little bit easier the more superficial it is. So one of the really good areas to take it is the radial artery, because it's sitting right on top of the ulnar bone there, and there's hardly any tissue over it, so you can get a really good pulse there. Also, the brachial artery is the same situation. The common carotid artery in the neck is another area where the vessel is going to be fairly close, although it's not lying over a bone. It is very superficial. So all those areas are areas where we can take the pulse because of their superficial nature. Now, when we're measuring blood pressure, you need two instruments. You need a stethoscope, which is going to pick up the intimate sounds of the pulse, and you're going to have a sphygmomanometer, which is going to be a pressure cuff that's going to cut off blood flow to the brachial artery. And we'll talk about how we use those two things to get the blood pressure in just a second. Measuring blood pressure is going to take on two different aspects. First of all, we have a systolic blood pressure, which is the pressure at the peak of ventricular contraction. When the left ventricle is pushing blood forcefully into the arteries, that's as high as the blood pressure will be. Okay, that's the systolic pressure. When the ventricle has relaxed and the blood is not being forcefully pushed through the arteries, that's when the pressure is going to be at its weakest or the lowest, and that's the diastolic pressure. And when we write this, we write the high pressure in a fraction over the low pressure. Now, down here at the end here, you can see millimeters of Hg. Hg is the chemical symbol for mercury. The reason why we still use that, although we don't use mercury sphygmomanometers very much anymore, I doubt very seriously whether there are very many doctors' offices that have the mercury sphygmomanometers anymore. Usually they're aneroid, but generally, when we first started taking blood pressures, we needed some kind of material that we could put in a vacuum in a tube that would move up and down the tube that would indicate pressure. We put a graduated scale in the back of a tube that was full of mercury. And whenever we wanted to measure what the blood pressure was, we'd measure the level, the top level of the mercury in the tube. And that's why we call it millimeters of mercury, because we're measuring how many millimeters of mercury are in the tube, in the graduated tube. So that's where that comes from. We no longer are measuring millimeters of mercury, but we've transcribed that into an aneroid sphygmomanometer. Measures the same thing. It's all relative. The pressure in the blood vessels are going to basically decrease that, and the greater the distance that you move from the heart. So basically, your better blood pressure is going to be closer to the heart, obviously. So when we're measuring arterial blood pressure, we generally do it in the arm, and a normal blood pressure in an adult might be something along the line of 120 over 80, 120 over 70 or 80. And in this particular example, that's what they're showing you. The course of the brachial artery of the arm is where we're going to be using the superficial artery to measure the blood pressure here. So generally what you do is you put the sphygmomanometer cuff over the top of the arm, and you're going to cut off with a the cuff is going to be pumped up with the little air pump, and what you're going to do is you have a stopcock on the pump, and it's going to you're going to open it up as you pump up the cuff, and then when you're finished pumping it up to the high level that you want it, then you'll counterclockwise turn the stopcock, and it will allow the air to come out very, very slowly, and you can read the millimeters of mercury on the graduated cylinder as you do this. Now, what you're doing is you're trying to cut off blood flow to this major artery here, this brachial artery. And when you do so and start leaving the air out, you're gradually going to allow blood flow to start again through this artery. The very first sound you hear when blood first starts going through there is what we're going to measure, the systolic blood pressure. Okay, so just when that when that cuff eases up enough to where blood can actually start coming through, when you listen with the stethoscope, you're going to hear a thump sound, and it's called asculating, and you're basically going to read along the sphygmomanometer tube. You're going to read what level that you see as you hear the first sound, and that will be your systolic blood pressure. So as you're leaving air out of the sphygmomanometer cuff, you're looking at your graduated cylinder there. This would be filled with mercury, and whenever you hear the first sound, you'd look over here on your graduated cylinder where the mercury is, and you'd note what that was. In this particular case, it would be at the 120 millimeters of mercury level. As you continue to leave the air out, the sounds are going to become louder and louder, and then at some point they start becoming more distinct. And I mean, eventually they're going to start getting softer and softer. The pressure at which the sound disappears is where you're going to record the diastolic pressure, where the pressure is at its lowest point. When you can't hear anymore, that means that you're done and you leave all the air out. So you listen for the first sound. That first sound you hear would be the systolic, and you note the level. And then as you continue to hear sounds, they'll get nice and firm, and then they'll start to get weaker and weaker until you hear no sound at all. And the last sound you hear will be the diastolic level. So you heard it first at 120 and you heard it last at 70. So it's 120 over 70 is the blood pressure. Now, blood pressure is going to be affected by lots of things, and a lot of times when you go to the doctor, if you're suspected of having high blood pressure, they will try to take your blood pressure at the same time of the day every time you go in to make sure that they're getting an accurate reading of what your overall blood pressure is, because blood pressure is going to be affected by a lot of things, and time of day would be one of them. It's also affected by your age. Generally speaking, blood pressure will rise as you get older. As your weight goes up, it will also rise. It will also rise during the course of exercise, and it will lower once you relax. What body position you're in, laying down, you should have a lower blood pressure than when you're sitting erect. Also, your emotional state. Are you relaxed or are you under great stress? That will make a difference on your blood pressure. The cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out of the left ventricle per minute that we talked about before. There are two components to blood pressure, and cardiac output is one of those. The other component is something we call the peripheral resistance, or generally speaking, this is how much friction the blood encounters as it moves through your vessels, how much pressure is being put up against your blood vessels as blood goes through it. So when you have the narrowing of blood vessels and increased blood volume, you're going to increase your peripheral resistance. So in order to get your overall blood pressure, you have two components that go into that, and that would be your cardiac output, and that would be multiplied by your peripheral resistance to get the overall blood pressure. So there are two components that go into blood pressure. Generally speaking, the sympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that controls your blood vessels in terms of whether they're vasoconstricting or vasodilating. If the sympathetic nervous system is sending impulses to a blood vessel, an artery, it's going to cause the vasoconstriction of the smooth muscle and contraction of the smooth muscle, and you'll get vasoconstriction there, and it will increase your blood pressure. If the sympathetic impulses are not going to your blood vessels, then you're going to have a relaxation of the smooth muscle, and you're going to have vasodilation. We also have renal factors that have an impact on your blood pressure. Your blood volume will overall have an impact because cardiac output is partially due to the amount of blood that you have in your system, right? So if your blood volume is going to be low, then that means your overall blood pressure is going to be low. We also have a hormone from your kidney that's put out. Your kidneys read the blood volume as the blood goes through it, and the arterial blood. If the arterial blood is low, there are cells, the receptor cells within the kidney that are going to put out a hormone called renin. Renin then puts out a series of reactions that form something else. I'm not going to go into all of the cascade of chemicals that go into this, but the bottom line is that it'll end up stimulating your adrenal gland to put out a hormone that will in turn cause the blood pressure to rise. I know that's a lot of things. There's like 5 or 6 steps that go into that, but overall your kidneys can also cause your blood pressure to rise if you have low blood volume, and conversely, if you have high blood volume, none of that will happen, and it will cause your blood pressure to go down. Something else that affects your blood pressure is the temperature. Heat has a vasodilating effect. Generally speaking, this explains why that your skin gets red when you're hot, and when it gets pale colored when you're cold. When it's when it's hot, you're going to have your skin is going to have vasodilation of the vessels in it, so they can disperse more heat. And in cold weather, you want to hold in more heat, so you don't allow vasoconstriction, and you don't allow as much blood to flow to go to your skin, and that's why it has a more pale look to it. There are lots of other chemicals that can cause differences in your blood pressure. Certain drugs will affect it. The bottom line is we have chemicals that we make within our body that affect it. We'd already talked about the one that came from a chain reaction from your kidneys, which was aldosterone being secreted by your adrenal gland. Also, the release of epinephrine, which we commonly call adrenaline, will cause an increase in blood pressure, and that's a release of a hormone from your adrenal gland also. The intake of certain chemicals on a daily basis can cause increase in blood pressure. A person that smokes cigarettes, nicotine is a very, very big vasoconstrictor. Both alcohol and a number of other drugs are going to cause a decrease in blood pressure or vasodilation. So various things that you put in your body are going to cause differences in your blood pressure. So that has a lot to do with it. When your doctor looks overall at your blood pressure, and you tend to have hypertension, high blood pressure, they're going to probably look at your diet to see how much salt you're intaking, how much saturated fats that you're taking in, which both of those over a long period can lead to hypertension. So the doctor would probably have you reduce the intake of those types of things in your diet. So this chart in your book goes through all the things I just talked about all the different things that go into either an increase or a decrease in the blood pressure. So you might want to scan over that chart. It's basically a summation of what we just talked about. Now, normal human range of blood pressure is what doctors are looking for when a healthy adult goes into the doctor's office. They're looking for a blood pressure that systolic is below 140. 140 is the borderline for hypertension, and usually you're going to be somewhere in the 75 to 80 in the diastolic range. Now, very seldom do people have too low a blood pressure. Only unhealthy people that maybe have bad diets or have diseases that cause blood proteins in the blood to not be produced. So systolic, if you're below 110, a lot of times they will look at reasons for that. Now, you can be extremely healthy and have 90 on your systolic too. That just depends on the person. So if you're hypotensive, that means you have below 110 on systolic, and that's, like I said, often associated with illness. If you're hypertension, basically that starts at about 140. 140 is your borderline. And it can be very dangerous if it's chronic, meaning it's an ongoing thing. Hypertension is often called the silent killer, and the reason for that is that we don't feel it. We don't feel high blood pressure. Some people say they do, but they really can't. And if you have high blood pressure for 20 years, basically it takes its toll on all the internal organs in your body. High blood pressure destroys blood vessels. It puts tears in blood pressure in vessels, and it can cause blood clots to start to appear in places that you don't want them, like in the heart. It can break down blood vessels that are helping to maybe like filter the blood in the kidneys. Lung function can be altered because of high blood pressure. So internal organs can be damaged on a long overall basis through chronic hypertension. So it's not good to have high blood pressure for a long period of time because it does do internal damage in all the organs. So high blood pressure or hypertension has to be dealt with, and people should know what their blood pressure is at all times so that they can avoid long-term chronic hypertension. Now, we did talk about the capillaries in the last talk we had. Basically, oxygen and nutrients are going to leave the blood in the capillaries, and they're going to go into the tissues. And they're going to be going into the interstitial fluid, or being dissolved in the interstitial fluid, and then go into the cells. And conversely, the carbon dioxide in the tissues will diffuse out into the interstitial fluid and then move into the blood in these capillary areas. So we're gonna pick up and drop off basically in the capillaries. It's a pick up and drop off area. Now, we've already talked about how materials get across the cell membranes, and I don't know that we really have to go through all that again here. Basically, they're giving specific names to things like fenestrations. These are oval pores, and some of the capillaries that allow for free movement of materials with concentration gradient. Some capillaries have gaps in them, intercellular clefts, where they allow things to freely move through diffusion. When we also move things through in active transport through vesicles and endocytosis and exocytosis. So those are the kinds of things we talked about already where we have movement across the cell membrane. And there's lots of different ways that occurs. So we have passive transport, which means materials can move with the concentration gradient through an opening or directly through a fat-soluble part of the cell membrane or through a pore. And then we have active transport, where we have materials being actively moved across against the concentration gradient, which would be like your sodium and potassium. Or you can have bulk materials moved across through exo and endocytosis. One of the things that we didn't really talk much about was pressures in the capillaries. Blood pressure forces fluid and solutes out of the capillaries along with diffusion. Okay, so osmotic pressure basically is that pressure of the movement of fluids with the concentration gradient. So if one area has a higher solute concentration, it's going to have a higher osmotic pressure to draw fluid, in particular, into the capillaries. So overall, the overall outlook here is in the capillaries is blood pressure is going to be higher than osmotic pressure at the arterial end of the capillary bed, and blood pressure is going to be lower at the than osmotic pressure at the venous end. A couple of things I wanted to mention here along with this. Hypotension is not a very common disorder. We've talked about hypertension, but hypotension, not a very common illness. Generally speaking, low blood pressure is a result of a lot of times poor physical conditioning, lifelong illnesses, things like that. There is something in terms of hypotension called orthostatic hypotension that is basically geared to the older people. When you get older, like we said, most of the systems don't work as nearly as well as they used to work. You have some compromises that you go through, and one of them is the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system doesn't work as quickly as it used to. So one of the things that happen is that if an older person may be sitting down or laying down on the couch and then quickly gets up off the couch, Usually the sympathetic nervous system quickly causes a constriction of blood vessels and an increase in blood pressure, so that there's not a lack of blood flow to the brain. Well, in orthostatic hypotension, we have a situation where the blood's going to pool briefly, and consequently, when you get up, you don't have as much blood delivery going to your brain, and it can cause you to be lightheaded or even pass out when you stand up quickly. So it's not something that's life-threatening or anything. It's just something that comes with age. So you just have to be aware of it if you're an older person. One of the other things that we haven't talked about is something called circulatory shock. This is a condition in which the blood vessels basically do not have a normal amount of blood in them, and the blood can't circulate normally. Usually this is due to some kind of a blood loss. So if a person got injured and their overall blood volume goes down, they can have a situation where they go into circulatory shock, where their heart rate's going to rise greatly because they do not have enough blood volume. So your heart is trying to compensate for that by beating faster, but unfortunately the beating of the heart becomes very weak, and it kind of works against itself. So it's a dangerous condition. One of the other homeostatic imbalances that I wanted to mention, I think I mentioned it before, is something called atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is a progressive fatty plaque buildup in the inside of the arteries, and it gets most of its notoriety from the fatty plaque buildup inside the arteries that feed heart muscle, and whenever these and in the brain, and whenever this occurs, it can cut off blood flow or cause ischemia and cause heart attacks or cause strokes. Atherosclerosis is sometimes looked at as a normal progression in older people. People that have family members that have had atherosclerosis are more likely to have atherosclerosis, but more research has actually shown that a lot of this has to do with diet also. So it has to do with heredity, but it also has to do with diet. A diet that's high in saturated fats many times will lead to a high level of high-density cholesterol, and that high-density cholesterol will cause that fatty plaque buildup in arteries. So what doctors will tell people a lot of times is to change their diet, and one of the things that will help reduce the fatty plaque buildup is exercise. A regular regime of cardiovascular exercise helps to slow that process down. When we talk about the developmental aspects of the cardiovascular system, one of the first things along with the brain to develop, well, the brain and the heart are obviously the two the most important organs in the body, and they both develop very, very early. Your heartbeat can be picked up within the fourth week of development, and it's basically a tube at this point. And the heart becomes a 4-chambered organ by the end of 7 weeks, and then pretty much after that, all it is a little bit of structural development as you develop toward your functional heart. Now, one of the things you also have to remember is that the liver and the lungs are basically non-functional, because the mother's basically taking care of most of that through her system. And so what happens in the development of the heart is that the blood is shunted away from those areas. So blood flow is very, very small going to those areas at the time of when the development of the fetus, because it doesn't have to go there. We don't have to send blood to the lungs to get oxygenated, because the mother is oxygenating the blood and so forth. And the same thing happens in the liver. But as the baby gets close to delivery, these shunts are going to dissolve, and basically those areas are opened up to complete blood flow by the time the baby is born. As we've always talked about, we talked about developmental aspects of each system and talk about the aging process. The aging process, with that, you undergo a lot of inefficiencies that go along with each of the systems, and the circulatory system is no exception to that. There are a number of problems that are associated with aging. First of all, the valves that are in the large veins, specifically in the lower extremities, tend to start weakening, and as this happens, blood can pool more in the lower extremities, and you can develop what's called varicose veins, which is basically a breakdown of the veins and a widening of these veins, and making these one-way valves that are in the veins non-functional, and pooling of blood occurs. One of the things that can occur there is you can have those varicose veins stripped out, and they're superficial veins on the outside of the leg, and they grow back, and basically there's no compromise to the body when the stripping occurs. The blood vessels grow back, and typically grow back healthy. Progressive atherosclerosis, as I just got through talking about, can happen, especially in people who have a hereditary content, and also in people who have a sedentary lifestyle, and people who are obese and have bad diets. As we said before, for every pound of fat that we put on our body, we add miles of blood vessels, and that takes a toll on the heart. The heart has to work much, much harder. Generally speaking, as high blood pressure occurs over a long period of time, and atherosclerotic activity, the heart starts to enlarge in a bad way. If you exercise, hypertrophy of the heart occurs, and it makes the heart stronger, and it makes the cardiac output increase, and it makes it more efficient. But there's also a type of hypertrophy where basically the cardiac muscle is overstretched, and the walls become thick, but they become weakened. And that's what we're talking about here. The heart loses some of its contractibility. So each pump of the heart is going to be weaker. People that have a hereditary content, and people that have lived a pretty much sedentary life, a lot of times they lose the elasticities in their vessels much, much quicker, and have chronic hypertension. Sometimes as much exercise as you can do, it still can't overcome the hereditary content, so then people have to basically take medicine to alleviate the hypertension. Coronary artery disease is the number one thing that kills people in the United States. This is the fatty plaque buildup of atherosclerotic tissue in coronary arteries that feed the cardiac muscle, and along with calcified deposits that go into those arteries. And this is probably the number one circulatory problem that we deal with, and also causes stroke in the brain. So, number one thing, coronary artery disease. We in the United States, we die from, generally more often from cardiovascular disease than anything else, more than even cancers. So, that's pretty much the end of the chapter. I am going to assign some of the review pages that are associated with this, and we'll finish up the chapter. And that's all for today. So, adios, amigos.